Okay, let's make a start, ladies and gentlemen. I feel somewhat humbled by the fact that whereas all the other speakers have given presentations on subjects which are of immediate and obvious relevance, I am proposing to talk on a subject which many of you may justly regard as of the utmost obscurity. My only possible justification is that I am an expert on the period, and for a quick commercial break, I have recently published a novel all about Rome and the Eastern Mediterranean in the 7th century. Copy available £8.99, or you can wait until next year and buy it from Bodrum and Stoughton. Commercial break over. Okay. In the year 628 AD, a long and extraordinarily brutal war ended in the Eastern Mediterranean. For 4 centuries, the Roman Empire and the Persian empires had been intermittently at war with each other. This reached a crisis in the early 7th century when the Persians launched an all-out attack on the Roman Empire or on the Eastern Roman Empire. It looked for a while as though the Eastern Roman Empire would go under. However, in 610, the Roman Empire got one of its most brilliant emperors, Heraclius, and he led the fight back against the Persians. He cleared them out of Asia Minor, he cleared them out of Syria and Egypt, and he pushed them far back beyond the Euphrates. He took the Persian capital Ctesiphon and burned it, and then in 628 he sat enthroned in the great church at Jerusalem and held a service of thanksgiving in the presence of the peace of the true cross. And it looked as though the restored East Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, call it what you will, not only was, but would always remain the greatest power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and indeed the greatest power in the Mediterranean world. And yet, just a few years later, 16 years later, in 644, there was an Arab raid out of the desert, and these Arabs, they defeated an imperial army at a place called Yarmouk. Now, barbarian raids were hardly very uncommon, and nobody worried about it. But then the Arabs pressed on. They took Damascus and Hierapolis. They marched on Edessa, and then they marched on Antioch, the capital of Syria, and they took it. And they marched on, and they only stopped when they crashed into the Taurus Mountains that separate Syria from Anatolia, or Asia Minor, or modern Turkey. And then the Arabs wheeled round, and they took Egypt. They took Alexandria, and then they carried on. And they took North Africa, they took Carthage, and then they carried on, and then of course once we get to 711 we move far beyond the remit of my talk. But the Arabs in a few years took the whole of the Eastern Roman Empire from here all the way to there. A remarkable achievement for a race of barbarians, so far an obscure race of barbarians. But what is even more remarkable is what then happened. When the barbarians in the West poured across the Rhine and the Danube, they destroyed much, but they also absorbed and preserved. The barbarians who took the western province of the Roman Empire, they adopted the Christian faith. They ultimately, in most places, adopted Latin as their language, and although the civilization that they took over declined and in some cases collapsed. They did not seek actively to destroy it, and they certainly could not replace it. Only in this province was there a race of particularly ferocious barbarians who were illiterate and who did not try to preserve, but who simply destroyed everything that they found. Elsewhere in the West, the barbarians were absorbed. Here in the East, the Arabs, once they had conquered, reset the historical clock. Within a few years, Greek had ceased to be the language of law, administration, learning, and commerce in those areas. It had been replaced by Arabic. Within those areas, within a short while, Christianity had ceased to be the dominant or even the majority religion. It had been replaced by Islam, a new religion. The transformation was complete. Complete in ways that we can hardly conceive. But let me say this. In the 15th century, an educated Westerner in Paris or in Rome or in London could look back on a long historical span. He could look back to Greece, and then to Rome, and then to a dark age that followed Rome, and then to the recovery of civilization. An educated Egyptian of the 15th century could look back to the 7th century when Islam broke in, but no further. That was the beginning of recorded history for an educated Egyptian and Syrian and indeed Persian. Now, one of the intermittently obsessive questions for historians of the period is how is it the Arabs could achieve this total transformation of what had for 1,000 years been the Greek East? Because we're not talking about minor provinces. Egypt, with its capital at Alexandria, had been Greek. It had been part of the Greek world for 1,000 years. The same with Antioch, and the same with all these other great cities in Egypt and in Syria. And these were not border provinces. Euclid, Eratosthenes, Ptolemy at Alexandria. Most of Greek science centered at Alexandria. It later period, perhaps, Libanius in Antioch, or Procopius, the greatest historian of the 6th century, in Caesarea in Syria. Antioch and Alexandria were the largest cities in the Greek world. They were the wealthiest. The centre of Greek theology was at Alexandria, and Antioch provided for that position. These were not border regions, these were the heartlands of Greek civilization. So how is it that Greek civilization was so utterly effaced from these regions? And I think the answer is that Greek civilization was effaced from these regions, wiped away from these regions, because although the cities had been Greek for 1,000 years, these regions themselves were not Greek. The Greeks in Egypt and in Syria were always a minority, but they were dominant minorities. They dominated the cities. And it's worth saying a number of things about early modern cities, or pre-modern cities, cities before the modern period, let's say. The first thing to be said is that before the modern period, cities were net consumers of population. Cities did not replace themselves, they were unhealthy places. Even without large-scale epidemic diseases, there were continual problems of sanitation, of bad food, bad water, and all the rest, which meant that the birth rate in cities was generally somewhat below the death rate. And so it was necessary for cities continually to replenish themselves with immigrants from the neighbouring regions. And so into Alexandria every year, or into Antioch every year, you would have a continual stream of immigrants from the countryside. The second thing to be said about these cities, however, is that there was a limit to the growth of their size. Cities like Rome and Constantinople might have reached a population of 1 million, might not. We don't know the figure, so it's probably impossible ever to settle this huge. Cities like Alexandria, with a particular advantage in terms of position and commerce, might reach half a million. But cities which were not imperial capitals and not immensely important trading centres like Ephesus, let's say, are unlikely ever to have exceeded 250,000 people. There were limits placed on the growth of ancient cities, or there were limits placed on the growth of pre-modern cities, forgive me, by the difficulties of importing food and by the lack of a public transport system which would move large numbers of people around. Cities before the early modern period really had to be confined within an area so that people could walk across them to do business. The third thing to say about these cities, and that's important, is that they were generally dominated by more or less exclusive oligarchies. I don't necessarily even exclude the democratic city-states like Athens. I certainly wouldn't exclude Alexandria, Antioch, Edessa, and Damascus. These were dominated by self-selecting city councils, by self-selecting guilds, and by other corporate organisations. Now, bearing in mind that cities were net consumers of population, it was necessary for these interlocking elites to allow in new entrants. It had to be done. But these oligarchies always placed quite high barriers to entry. And in the Greek East, the barriers to entry were a knowledge of the Greek language and a general adherence to the Greek way of life. And so what you have is this kind of family story. Somebody comes in from the country districts to Antioch. He is a Syriac speaker, he knows no Greek. He becomes a sausage seller and he makes a fair bit of cash in doing that. He is a Syriac speaker, he's also a Monophysite heretic. He doesn't like the Greeks don't like him. He is useful and he makes some money. He knows enough Greek to deal with tax collectors and administration. He is, however, ambitious for his family, so he sends his son to school to get him a good Greek education. He is bilingual in Greek and in Syriac, and although he remains a Monophysite heretic or an historian, one of the other many heresies within the region, although he is not an Orthodox Christian, he keeps his heterodoxy rather quiet and can pass as a Greek. His son, of course, learns Greek and doesn't know Syriac. And so the family is absorbed into the Greek-speaking elite of that city. And such had been continuing for 1,000 years between the first conquests of Alexander the Great, who swept down into Asia Minor, into Syria, into Egypt, and then struck out east. Such had been the case from the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, right up until the time of Justinian in the middle of the 6th century AD. Now, what is it that happened? And the answer, I think, is a demographic collapse which disrupted the transmission of Greek culture within the cities. In the year 544, this is 100 years before the Arab invasions, in the year 544, the bubonic plague arrived along the trade routes here. It then spread straight up through Syria, to Asia Minor, to Constantinople. where, so far as we can tell, it killed 60% of the population. It then spread throughout the rest of the Mediterranean world, even probably reaching England. We don't have mortality figures for the Mediterranean world as a whole. We do have the history of the time written by Procopius, a most remarkable historian, and he says that during the central summer months in Constantinople, 10,000 people a day died of the plague. Now, you should never trust ancient statistics, because there were no ancient statistics. They were impressionistic numbers. But Procopius does give a number of details which are entirely credible. The breakdown of all administration, the dead lying unburied in the streets, great rafts of dead taken out into the Golden Horn and left to drift, so that sometimes they're carried out to sea, sometimes they'd come back to shore. 70,000 dead bodies bricked into the walls of the city, so that people's stomachs were turned whenever the wind blew from a certain direction. We do not need to trust Procopius' figure of 10,000 a day for 3 months. That would give Constantinople a population about the size of London in 1850, which is not very likely. But through our knowledge of other outbreaks of bubonic plague in the early modern period, we can be reasonably assured that at least a third of the population died, and it might be as high as 60%. We also know from fragmentary evidence by chroniclers in the West that the plague hit just as badly there. It hit in the country districts as well. Crops rotted on the ground, cows ran around, crying out because there was nobody to milk them. Could you just move the touchpad? Oh dear.
It's coming on. It's coming on.
Okay. Now, what happened? Well, what the plague did was to cause not only a demographic crisis in the Mediterranean world, but a cultural crisis. When 60% of agricultural slaves or agricultural workers die, and when 60% of unskilled workers die, it's very sad for the people who die, and it is immediately disruptive of the economy of that region. But these are losses which can be replaced reasonably fast. You have some changes in the structure of relative prices and wages. You have a selective abandonment of lands, and a few years later, you do not see any significant differences. But what happens when you lose 60% of all the Greek teachers, of all the people qualified to serve in the administration? 60% of the Greek-speaking lawyers, 60% of all those minorities in the cities who spoke Greek. The answer is that the Greeks lose their critical mass. And there are positions in the administration, there are positions in the various guilds, which were once occupied as of right by Greeks, but which was now to be filled up, if at all, with Syriac speakers and Coptic speakers. And what happened, as far as I can tell, is that long before the Arabs turned up in Syria and in Egypt and Islamized those regions had stopped being Greek. It is not the case that the Arabs broke into a viable Greek-speaking world of Syria and Egypt and by some miracle transformed them into Arab Islamic regions within 2 generations. What seems far more likely is that the Arabs moved into regions which had long since been effectively taken over by Semites, by Syriac speakers and by Coptic speakers. And these indigenous Coptic and Syriac Monophysite elites found that they had rather more in common with the Islamic Arabs, than with the Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians centred in Constantinople and in Asia Minor. Now this is all very conjectural because we do not have population figures from the period, we do not have any demographic analyses, and we must rely on incidental details. It's a bit like trying to do a jigsaw puzzle where 3/4 of the pieces are missing. We've been doing this for 500 years, and we'll probably be doing it for another 500 years without reaching certain conclusions. But what we're talking about is far-reaching cultural changes which follow from a demographic change. And what I'm talking about is cultural change which follows from a demographic collapse. Now, we do have a similar case from the late Middle Ages. In 1348, the Black Death hit England, killed a third of the population, and within a few years there had been a profound cultural change here in England. Until 1348, the language of the royal court, the language of administration, the language of law had been French. It is not the case that England was ruled by French elites. The Norman conquerors have long since intermarried, but through simple inertia, French had continued as the official language of the state. Then in 1348, you have the Black Death. A third of the English population is killed. We know from the chronicles that there was an immediate shortage of French teachers. Within a few years, the language of the royal court was English. By the end of the 14th century, the parliamentary records are kept in English, and the language of law has become English. Norman French continues well into the 18th century as the language for legal pleadings, but as the lawyers will quite understand, it is one of the functions of lawyers to preserve all abuses which are likely to increase their incomes. But French has died as the language of law and administration in England within maybe a generation of the Black Death. And we can use that example, for which we have much better evidence, as indicative evidence of what happened in the perhaps far more important cultural transformation of the East in the 7th and 8th centuries. Or, if we look not at demographic collapses, but at demographic expansions, and this is what may make my talk relevant to some of you, we could look at what happened in Bohemia and Moravia in the 19th century. Now in the 17th century, Bohemia, Moravia, what is now the Czech Republic? Those were Czech lands in every respect. There were Czech peasants, there was a Czech aristocracy, there were Czech intellectuals, and there was a Czech middle class. There were, of course, significant German minorities, but these were Czech lands. And then for reasons which I don't need to discuss, these regions were extensively Germanized. So much so that by the 18th century, when Mozart turned up in Prague, he found a German city. It was a German city. And any Czech of ability who wanted to succeed had to learn German. Some years ago, I had a minor shock when I discovered that Gluck, the great German composer, was in fact Czech. And that Johann Christian van Hal, another great composer, was in fact born Jan Krzysztof van Hal, a Czech who had Germanized himself. And Mr. Czech, another moderately great composer. I guess that he wasn't Austrian, but he spoke German. And Hummel, he was a Slovak. I'm talking about composers because they're the people whom I know most for that period. But it is generally the case that any Czech of ability in the 18th century who wanted to succeed would turn himself into a German. And so the German elites in Prague, in Brno, in all of those places, they were recruited by Czechs. Then, in the middle 19th century, the restraints on the growth of cities that I mentioned broke down. Sewers were built in Prague, and Prague was connected with far distant regions by railway trains. And so you had clean water, you didn't have filth lying in the streets, and food could be brought in from long distances at cheap prices. And so Prague stopped being a net consumer of populations. Its birth rate exceeded its death rate, and there were no restraints for the growth of the population through immigration from the countryside. No longer hundreds and thousands of Czechs poured in to be Germanized at the time, but tens of thousands of Czechs poured into cities like Prague. And by the middle of the 19th century, they had formed a critical mass of their own. They no longer needed to Germanize themselves in order to be successful. They could remain Czechs. Oh, they would be bilingual, and most educated Czechs were bilingual in Czech and German well into the 20th century, indeed many still are. But the cultural and economic elites in cities like Prague increasingly stopped being German and became Czech because of this demographic change, this mass immigration from the countryside into the towns. Now, let us stop talking about cities, because cities are perhaps nowadays less important than they were as the centres of cultural life. We can perhaps talk about entire countries. Are we perhaps seeing a similar process going on at a much higher level? London and Paris no longer enjoy large immigrations from Kent and from the various departments of France. England and France, as countries, now enjoy very substantial immigrations from other parts of the world. At the beginning of this wave of immigrations in the 1950s, it was expected that the newcomers should assimilate, that they should learn English and French, or the language of the country in which they had settled, and they should, so far as possible, try to turn themselves into Frenchmen and Englishmen, or whatever. But as time has gone by, and as the numbers have continued to swell, it has become less necessary in order to be successful to learn the language and adopt the ways of the host society. Indeed, more than that, policies of certain Western governments have positively discouraged newcomers from assimilating. Now, whether this is good or bad, it is not something that I wish to comment on. But it is worth saying that if you are an Englishman, or if you are a Frenchman, you may regard your particular national territory as yours by right. It's always been yours. It always will be yours. There may be a few cultural changes attendant on large movements of population, but those are changes which will be limited in their extent. I think a Greek speaker in Alexandria or in Antioch might have thought the same around the year 500. These have always been Greek-speaking cities. The Greeks had always predominated in those regions, or at least had for 1,000 years back. It always had been, and it always would be. Yet within 150 years, those cities would cease to be Greek. And so, what I would say in conclusion, and I've taken just under half of the, I've taken just under half an hour, what I would say in final conclusion is that demography is important. Demography is important to explain large-scale cultural transformations in the past, and of course it is important perhaps to predict equally far-reaching cultural changes in the future, or at least to see to what extent we can meet those changes. But I'm aware of the fact that there will be an extended question and answer session. I have finished everything I want to say, but I'm sure if you have questions, you'll ask me to say more. So thank you for your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen.
Question to Sean Gabb. You drew a parallel between the immigration into the Greek cities in the 7th century of people of different ethnicities and the immigration of non-Europeans into European cities in the last, over the last 50 years or so. But there is this difference. In the 7th century, immigrants into the Greek cities were obliged to assimilate because they had to make a living. So they had to learn a language and probably adopt the mores of the Greek, of the local Greeks. Today, immigrants from non-European countries do not need to assimilate because they can live on welfare. And many of them are quite happy, apparently, to live on welfare. So they do not trouble to learn the language, and they do not trouble to seek employment. I attribute this to a new disease. Paul Gottfried gave us the concept of the disease of egalitarianism. May I propose a new disease, the disease of excessive altruism, which has spread throughout the European peoples.
Yes. I don't think that's a question. It's more a supplementary comment. All I would say is that immigrants to the eastern cities in the 7th century were not of a different ethnicity from the Greek-speaking elites in those cities. Greeks were defined not by ethnicity, but by culture. Nevertheless, the differences between the Syriac and Coptic-speaking newcomers to those cities and the Greek elites was every bit as profound, I suppose, as the differences between the newcomers to Western countries and the indigenous peoples there. It is always a question of how these things are managed. And I do agree that Western governments have not been as responsible as they might have been in encouraging the assimilation of newcomers. Perhaps governments do not really need to encourage assimilation, they simply need not to interfere in prevention. But this has been going on now for the better part of 30 years, the multicultural model of immigration, and it is difficult now to see how what has happened in the past 30 years in the way of blocked assimilation can now be undone. So there is a problem, I agree.
My question is also to Sean Gabb, and you described very well how different outcomes was of barbarian invasion into western part of the Roman Empire and Arab invasion into the eastern part. But outcomes are quite different. Barbarians took some important parts of Roman heritage as their own, while Arabians did not. And could you comment more about reasons why it happened? So, because demographic tendencies doesn't explain this. And one more comment about cities, and especially in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, many of important European cities were a kind of multicultural cities, and including Jewish population. And actually, those communities lived quite separate from each other. And is this somehow related to your analysis of the demographic will take over of the cities?
Well, I think one of the reasons why the Arabs over why Syria and Egypt became Islamic was because they had ceased being Greek. They were already Semitic regions when the Arabs turned up. As I said earlier, the Syriac speakers and Coptic speakers, although they were Christians, had rather more in common with the Arab invaders than they had with the Orthodox Greeks ruling in Constantinople. But going to your point about the multicultural nature of early modern European cities, I do quite agree. I am rather conservative in my inclinations, and I do not like to see large areas of what I would regard as my country become foreign. But that being said, this was a fairly common experience in many Central and East European cities until the middle of the 20th century. And so long as a large and activist government was not there to coerce integration, these situations did not seem to lead to large-scale troubles. The problem may not be multiculturalism, it may be state-enforced multiculturalism. It may be that a certain degree of self-segregation is a necessary part of multiculturalism. I'm not saying that I like it, I'm just saying that multiculturalism need not be the corrosive force that in the past 30 or 50 years it has become in many Western countries.